fair competition are fundamental to advanced sharing prosperity in our country. Competition in markets leads to lower prices and higher quality goods and services, ensuring that consumers don't overpay for products and services they rely on, whether it's a vital medication or broadband internet. Workers also benefit when businesses compete for their labor. Competition for workers incentivizes firms to pay good wages or risk losing their workers to competitors, and thereby serving as a counterbalance to rising corporate power and enabling workers to bargain for better working conditions. And competitive markets allow everyday Americans to take a chance on an idea and start a business. Or maybe they innovate on a product and make it more affordable. Research shows the possibility of a new entrance into a market compels existing firms to continue investing in people and capital to stay ahead, which also elevates the United States as a leader in the global economy. Well, we're here today because corporate concentration imperils shared prosperity and exacerbates economic inequality. Across industries, including healthcare, financial services, telecommunications, agriculture, and more, we're seeing much higher levels of concentration than were there 3 decades ago. And evidence shows this has led to weaker business investment, higher prices for consumers, and lower wages for workers. This consolidation of corporate power has allowed the wealthiest at the top to capture a larger share of the gains from economic growth. Amid record-breaking profits, corporations pay less in taxes today than they did 30 years ago, while investing 10 cents less per dollar of profit. And all this has led to reduced productivity gains in concentrated industries and slower growth economy-wide. This is a problem because consumers are bearing the burden. On average, we pay about twice as much for cell phone plans than some of our friends in other advanced economies with more providers. The same is true for broadband access. With more competition, hardworking Americans could save billions each year. Our workers are also paying for this in the form of stagnant wages. Research shows the median American household loses an estimated $5,000 each year through reduced wages and higher prices caused by a lack of competition. Now, how did we get here? Well, the explosion of mergers and acquisitions have played a key role in the consolidation of industries. Over the past 40 years, they have been allowed to proceed at an unprecedented pace. And the same holds for an array of anti-competitive practices by industry leaders. Well, this is due in part to our failed experiment with more lax enforcement of antitrust laws and the underfunding of federal enforcement agencies. During this time, our economy has lost half of its firms on a per capita basis. And this has disproportionately impacted marginalized communities where we've seen a disappearance of independent grocery stores, pharmacies, and community banks. And the rise of non-compete agreements is also part of the story. At least 1 in 3 businesses require that workers sign non-compete agreements, which suppress workers' wages, hinder their ability to pursue better opportunities, and contribute to persistent racial and gender disparities. And about 1 in 5 workers without a college education is subject to these non-compete agreements. The good news is that there are steps that we as a country can take to reduce this concentration of corporate power, and we'll hear more about these proposals from our expert panel today. Additionally, there have been productive bipartisan conversations here on Capitol Hill about how best to tackle these challenges. Following a bipartisan investigation that uncovered evidence of ample anti-competitive practices, the House Judiciary Committee recently approved 6 bipartisan bills to address business concentration and bolster competition on digital platforms. In the Senate, my dear friend and colleague, Senator Klobuchar, wrote an entire book about antitrust, the challenges we face, and what we can do to make our economy more competitive. Earlier this year, the Senator introduced the Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act. Among other things, this bill would give federal enforcers more resources to do their jobs and strengthen prohibitions on anti-competitive conduct. The Senator will tell us more about this and some of her other ideas shortly. We have an opportunity now to restore a competitive economy and advance shared prosperity. President Biden's executive order advances a whole of government approach to promote fair competition. And it's now our turn to act here in Congress with bold, decisive action. And this is why I look forward to the testimonies and insights of our witnesses today. Now I'd like to turn this over to Senator Mike Lee, another leading voice in this space, for his opening statement. Senator Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. From our earliest days, it's been businesses, both large and small, that have been the backbone of our country. As Calvin Coolidge once put it, the chief business of the American people is business. From colonial farmers to pioneering homesteaders, to merchants, craftsmen, and professionals. American entrepreneurs have sought to build a better life for themselves and achieve the American dream. For centuries, Americans who are innovative have come together through commerce and competition to improve life for themselves and their families and their communities. It's no surprise then that American businesses are a source of local and national pride. They're often more than just a place to work. They add vitality into our neighborhoods, our towns, our cities, and communities. Businesses are also the heartbeat of our economy. Small businesses, in particular, represent about half of all private sector jobs in the United States, nearly half of the US GDP, and they account for 2 out of every 3 jobs created in the United States today. Over the years, we've seen the rise of a number of big businesses, and today we're again witnessing the increasing market power of a few large firms. Of course, this raises some important questions. A lot of people are concerned, understandably, that the largeness of certain enterprises makes them dangerous. Some say inherently dangerous to small businesses and to consumers and to workers. However, the fact is that big is not always bad, but neither is it always good. And we shouldn't be forced to pretend that it's either one way or the other. To imply that we should support or defend a business simply based on its size is unserious, and it's meant to move the conversation away from a firm's specific conduct. The rise of some highly visible large firms is oftentimes a product of their greater market-based innovations. The prospect of gaining a larger market share incentivizes competition that can lead to better products and services at lower prices. Market share won through competition should be celebrated, not punished. Changing technology and increasing investment in software processes and R&D may also be an important factor. In industries where these investments are protected by patents, policy has explicitly created government-granted monopolies. We allow this because the prospect of collecting monopoly profits acts as an incentive for firms to innovate and invest in new ideas. In other areas, new investments are associated with higher productivity gains, especially in the high-tech and consumer sectors, suggesting that these businesses have gained greater efficiencies through market competition. But there are other factors behind industry concentration, factors that could indeed be cause for concern and deserve our attention. For instance, government regulations impose huge stifling barriers to new business creation and protect existing firms from competition. From 2010 to 2020, the US government imposed an average of 365 new regulations each year, affecting everything from how farmers make their livings to which employees small business owners are legally allowed to hire, to how many workers they can afford to pay. These regulations impose tremendous costs on American businesses, workers, and taxpayers, costing an average of $81 billion per year and requiring 77 million hours of paperwork annually. This burden disproportionately falls on small businesses and startups. In fact, there's plenty of evidence showing that regulatory accumulation reduces the number of small businesses relative to larger ones. In this regard, federal, state, and local regulations are locking out small businesses from competing and thus further entrenching big businesses. Reducing regulatory requirements on American business would help foster more market competition. With more market competition, anytime, you're going to increase quality and reduce prices, and that's good for consumers. Antitrust enforcement has also been declining for decades. Some monopolies are indeed bad, and those that rise or remain through anti-competitive and exclusionary conduct, and not through competition on the merits, stand in the way of free markets, and they degrade the options available to consumers. A proper response in this regard is to modernize antitrust laws to find the right balance between over-enforcement and under-enforcement. That's exactly why I've introduced the Tougher Enforcement Against Monopolists, or TEAM Act. which would preserve free market competition by codifying the consumer welfare standard and strengthening enforcement against companies that engage in anti-competitive behavior. Other efforts, like the administration's recent executive order on competition, unfortunately missed the mark by overstepping the president's authority and massively expanding federal regulatory power. But whatever action we take, we ought to remember that big businesses are not necessarily harmful if workers continue to find well-paying jobs and consumers continue to benefit from high-quality, diverse, and low-cost goods and services. The ability for them to do that, of course, is always enhanced by robust competition. The beauty of our free market economy is that whatever your cause or your career, your success depends on your service. The way to look out for yourself is to look out for those around you. The way to get ahead is to help other people do the same and to put your God-given talents and efforts to work in the service of your neighbor. In the process of earning money and building wealth, individuals can add value to other people's lives. In all of our efforts going forward, we ought to ensure that businesses, both large and small, are able to keep doing just that. And I'm hopeful that today's hearing will aid us in achieving this goal. Thank you.
Senator Lee, thank you very much. And thank you for introducing the TEAM Act. Seems like very much in the right direction. And now it's my honor to introduce the distinguished senator from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar, who has just written a book entitled Antitrust, lest we have any confusion about what the book is about. And if I can quote from a review in the New York Times, it says it's an impressive work of scholarship, deeply researched, highly informative, and surprisingly readable in the bargain. Senator Klobuchar, we'll never forget the picture of you announcing for president in the snowstorm, but we'd love to hear what you have to say about antitrust. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And since I have the floor, I will now read all 600 pages of the book into the record. No, I will try to give a summary of my views here. And I first want to thank you for having the foresight for having this hearing. I want to thank my colleague, Senator Lee. We had a hearing yesterday in our subcommittee together on what we can do about pharmaceutical prices. And we've introduced a number of bills together, including one with Representative Buck and Cicilline to give the state attorney generals some more tools to use as we take on this major problem of monopolies. I think we all know in our different ways that America has a monopoly problem, whether you are a cattle producer trying to bring your beef to market, whether you are someone that's trying to get a deal on online travel and suddenly find out that all the websites you go to, 90% of them are owned by really two companies, whether you are someone that wants to get a fair price on a prescription drug, where we know we've seen such enormous price increases in America over the last 2 decades. And then finally, of course, if you're someone that's trying to get the truth off of a social media platform, or you are trying to protect your privacy, and you wonder why there aren't all these bells and whistles that would do that, or why Google was able to, or Facebook, hold an entire country hostage, which is the country of Australia, when they simply tried to charge for content and make sure that the news organizations were getting a fair deal. Well, this is about monopolies, and I truly appreciated the title of your hearing because this is something that has gone on since the Gilded Age, and this could be well characterized, as you called it, as a second Gilded Age in this country. And I think the answers are right before us. There is a focus, and there should be, on some specific solutions. Senator Lee and I had an incredible hearing on app stores, in which we actually had to push Apple to even get us a witness. And we did, and we had companies from Spotify to Match.com testify about how much they had to pay out just to use the app stores, which are pretty much today's modern websites. There are things we can do in that area. There are things we can do from patent thickenings patent thickets to the issues that we have with pay for delay in pharma. There's privacy legislation to be passed. But then let's go a step further. And I think we need an overhaul of our antitrust laws if you really want to get at all these things at once. Switching the burden for the big mega mergers, looking back into some very consolidated industries, not all industries, but the most consolidated ones where you have dominant players, to figure out what needs to be done. Do some assets have to be divested? Do we have to put better bumpers in place on consent decrees and agreements? And all of this to me leads to something that Senator Lee mentioned, which is enforcement. And I don't think that our agencies can take on the biggest companies the world has ever known with Band-Aids and duct tape. And that's why Senator Grassley and I passed in the US Senate our bill to change the merger fee structure, which hasn't happened for decades, which is now over in the House, and I know has some good, strong bipartisan support, which, without hurting any small companies or mergers in small companies, would actually bring in over $100 million because of the way we change the structure of this for the FTC and for the DOJ Antitrust Division. So that's number one. Number two is what I've already mentioned, the standard change. And number three, something that you've had the foresight to look at, which is other things that can be done, like allowing workers to go to another job if they want. Oh, very radical. With non-compete agreements being used only in the circumstances that fit them, as opposed to frontline workers. Making sure that, to me, immigration reform is a piece of this, and making sure that we have the workers that we need when we're facing a labor shortage. And then also looking at our STEM education and allowing new workers to go into the workforce. I just bring up a few of those ideas, but there's many, many more. And I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and the ranking member. And I'm really excited. And I think there were some really good things in the White House's President Biden's executive order. And if you don't think he means business when he's governing right now, he just came over to the Senate caucus today, and I think we all know he means business. And secondly, the work that we can do here on a bipartisan basis in Congress. And I do want to say that I've gotten to know Representative Buck and, of course, Cicilline quite well, and I really appreciate their bipartisan efforts over in your House of Representatives. So thank you for allowing me to say a few words.
Senator Klobuchar, thank you very much. And thank you for writing the 600-page book that gives us a blueprint for much of what we can do. It's wonderful to have you on this committee.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce our four distinguished witnesses. Dr. Thomas Philippon is a professor of finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's published widely on macroeconomics and finance, including the market power of large firms. In his 2019 book, The Great Reversal, he explores the causes and consequences of increased concentration and decreased competition in the US economy. His research finds that American consumers, workers, and potential new entrants are shouldering the costs of rising corporate consolidation. Dr. Philippon has a PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he is in Paris tonight on Bastille Day. And I'd like you to note that we freed him from the prison today in order to testify with us tonight. Dr. Kate Bond is the Director of Labor Market Policy and Interim Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her research focuses on gender, race, and ethnicity in the labor market, care work, and monopsony. She's written extensively about the impact of the lack of competition in labor markets and how it gives employers unfair wage-setting power to undercut the earnings of workers and increase their own profits. Her work shows how increasing workers' bargaining power by strengthening unions can counteract the effects of employers' market power. Dr. Bond received her PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research. Ms. Stacy Mitchell is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where she directs its independent business initiative. Her research and reporting have focused on the importance of small businesses and the public policies driving their decline. And she has analyzed the shift in antitrust policy towards maximum efficiency over promoting fair and open markets for all competitors. She's the author of the book, Big Box Swindle, which details how mega retailers are fueling many of our most pressing social and economic challenges. Ms. Mitchell has a bachelor's degree in American economic and labor history from Macalester College. And finally, we have Mr. Chris Edwards, a prior or a veteran legacy employee of the Joint Economic Committee. And Chris is now the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He previously served as Senior Economist for the Republican staff for the Joint Economic Committee. He's recognized for his work on federal and state tax and budget issues. In addition to his work with the JEC, Mr. Edwards has served as a manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers as an economist with the Tax Foundation. Mr. Edwards has an MA in economics from George Mason University. Dr. Philippon, let's begin with your testimony, and then we will continue in the order of introductions. Dr. Philippon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Bayer, Vice Chairman Heinrich, and Ranking Member Lee for giving me the opportunity to testify in front of you today. So I would like to organize my remarks in two parts. First, a quick review of the evidence, what we know, what we don't know. And then I will try to explain the main consequences of excessive market power, where it exists, focusing on inequality and growth. And then in conclusion, I'll just discuss some policy options. So first, the evidence. Well, obviously the most discussed, the most popular evidence is concentration. And indeed, we've seen that many industries have become more concentrated over the past 20 years. Now, concentration is an important warning sign because it can suggest that some firms have increased their market power. But concentration is not by itself a conclusive indicator. And the main reason is concentration can increase for various reasons. Or like Senator Lee just said, big is not always bad. So instead of looking at market shares at a point in time, which is what concentration does, I find it useful to consider how market shares can change over time. Now, in a competitive industry, we might very well have a dominant firm at a point in time. But if the industry is competitive, we don't expect that firm to remain dominant forever. And unfortunately, if you look at the data, this kind of healthy reshuffling has decreased over the past 20 years. If you look at the largest 100 firms in the US in the year 2000, you will see that 55 out of these 100 firms were relative newcomers. If you look at 2019, and again, you look at the 100 largest firms in the US, the fraction of newcomers, instead of being 55%, is now down to 29%. The 71 other firms had been in the top 100 for every year of the past 10 years. So this reshuffling has decreased over time. Another indicator which is important, obviously, is profits, payouts, and investment. Now, the share of after-tax corporate profits in GDP has increased by roughly 50% since 2000. Again, that might not be an issue if high profit led to high investment. The problem is this is not what happened. Investment, in fact, has been relatively weak. And instead, firms have not used their higher profits to increase investment. Instead, they have used the profits to increase their payouts to shareholders. So the ratio of payouts to total assets has roughly doubled since 2000. Now, there are many other industry studies that are detailed and show that US consumers pay higher prices that are too high. There is also studies that look at the labor market. But let me now turn to the consequences. So based on the broad review of the evidence, I think that prices in the US are somewhere between 7 or 8% higher today than they would be if competition had remained as healthy as it was in the late 1990s. So what are the consequences? Well, first, higher prices. So the median household spends about $53,000 a year. I estimate they pay about 7 or 8% to high prices. That means that they pay about $3,700 each year in monopoly rents. If you add that across all the households in the US, you get about $600 billion in excessive monopoly rents. Now, this leads to lower living standards and higher inequality. But that's not yet the end of the story. The numbers I've discussed so far, they don't take into account the impact of competition on growth, that is on investment and productivity. Once you factor in the impact of competition on investment, then you find that if we could return to a high level of competition that we had 20 years ago, GDP would increase by about 5%, which is $1 trillion. Finally, because increased investment would lead to higher real wages, households would gain not just as consumers via lower prices, but also as workers via higher real wages. So if we go back to this median household we discussed earlier, the improvement in living standards would be something like $5,000 once we've taken into account both lower prices and higher wages. So to conclude, I think that this shows that the stakes are high. To make it short, if you improve competition, it's the same as cutting taxes for working families by $600 billion per year, except you don't have to actually increase the deficit to do it. You would also boost the economy by something like $1 trillion each year. So the stakes are high. The policy challenges are real because we don't know for sure what are the better tools and exactly which to act first. But I think that if you review the evidence very broadly, you see at least four broad goals that would be useful in all cases. First, tighten merger reviews. Second, reduce barriers to entry. Third, improve price transparency. And fourth, reduce switching costs for consumers. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Dr. Philippon, very much. We'll come back to you with many questions in the minutes to come. But now let me introduce Dr. Kate Bond for her testimony.
Thank you, Chair Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, and members of the Joint Economic Committee for inviting me to testify today. My name is Kate Bond, and I'm the Director of Labor Market Policy and the Interim Chief Economist at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We seek to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies that promote strong, stable, and broad-based growth. Mounting evidence, which I will review today, demonstrates how the rising concentration of corporate power has increased economic inequality, which has dragged down economic growth. Today, I'll explain what causes an economic concept called monopsony, how it impacts different workers, and finally, how policy can push back on employers having significant monopsony power over the market and over workers. The United States boasts one of the wealthiest economies in the world, but decades of increasing income inequality, job polarization, and stagnant wages for most Americans has plagued our labor market. This has demonstrated that a rising tide does not lift all boats. Monopsony is a key economic concept to understand in this discussion. Monopsony is the labor market equivalent of the better-known phenomenon of monopoly, but instead of having only one seller of a good or service, there's effectively only one buyer of a good or service. Like a monopoly, this phenomenon is not limited when a firm is strictly the only buyer of labor. When employers have outsized power, they're able to set wages for their workers rather than wages being determined by competitive market forces. Given this monopsony power, employers undercut workers. One recent survey of all the economic research on monopsony finds that, on average across studies, employers have the power to keep wages over 1/3 less than what they would be in a perfectly competitive market. Firms can use monopsony power to lower workers' wages due to a number of common occurrences in the labor market. First, if there are few potential employers. Second, if workers face job mobility constraints. Third, if workers can only gather imperfect information about employers and jobs. Fourth, when workers have divergent preferences for job attributes. And finally, fifth, when workers lack the ability to bargain over wages and working conditions. While concentrated labor markets are not the norm, they are pervasive across the US. Research has found that 60% of US local labor markets are highly concentrated. This accounts for 20% of employment in the United States. It has been particularly pernicious in rural areas. When markets are very concentrated, employers can give workers smaller yearly raises or make working conditions worse, knowing that their workers have nowhere to go to find a better job. But as I noted, concentration is not the only source of monopsony power. Job mobility, which is the ability to move easily between jobs, also affects labor markets and in turn may give employers the power to set wages below competitive levels. Job mobility can be limited by non-compete agreements where workers are compelled to sign away their right to go work for a direct competitor of their employer. Asymmetric information between employers and workers also influences how workers sort between jobs and puts downward pressure on wage offers. Workers often know little about the salary range of their potential employers or even within their own firms. In contrast, employers know what all their employees are paid and often require applicants to disclose their current salaries or competing job offers, giving them much more information to work with. And finally, varied worker preferences also gives employers the power to undercut wages. Workers who are more likely to face hostile work environments, among them Black workers in primarily white occupations or women in male-dominated fields, may prefer workplaces that are more inclusive. Or parents who have primary responsibility for caretaking for their children may need a more predictable schedule or autonomy over their schedules. This limits mobility and lowers wages. The concentration of corporate power has dire consequences for workers who are already disadvantaged in the US economy. Workers facing hiring discrimination, such as women, Black, and Latinx workers, will have fewer job offers, so they'll be forced to accept substandard opportunities. and having an unstable fallback position without personal wealth or adequate income supports may reduce the ability of a worker to search for a job that is both the best fit and garners the highest possible wages. Employers are able to exploit these conditions by undercutting workers' wages without risking losing their labor supply, amplifying the negative consequences of rising corporate power. Reversing the trends that caused this second Gilded Age starts with ensuring that the U.S. economy is competitive. The Biden administration is starting to strengthen enforcement against anti-competitive conduct, but this can go further, including new laws that would codify, clarify, and strengthen antitrust law for labor markets. But antitrust actions alone are not sufficient. Another important way to address the concentration of corporate power is to build countervailing power for workers. The Protecting the Right to Organize Act would expand the ability of unions to organize workers and would limit the employer's ability to exploit workers along multiple axes. One feature of a monopolistic labor market is that wages are artificially suppressed, so there's room to raise the floor with tools such as increasing the minimum wage. Finally, giving workers universal protections and investing in social infrastructure would provide a stable foundation for workers to search for quality jobs. Building the foundation of security for workers not only directly impacts their well-being, but also provides the foundation for productivity growth through better job matches and stronger economic growth through increased incomes. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. The questions will come, I promise. Let me now introduce Ms. Mitchell, Stacy Mitchell, for your testimony.
Thank you and good afternoon, Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Lee, Senator Klobuchar, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to this important hearing. I am the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Several years ago, I set out to study a crucial question: what's killing America's small independent businesses? In the 1980s, businesses with fewer than 100 employees accounted for 40% of all business revenue. Today, their share has dropped to 20%. And this trend has been accelerating. In the last decade, we've lost tens of thousands of small retailers, distributors, manufacturers, and more. The story that we've long told ourselves about the decline of small business is that they can't keep up. We assume big corporations are inherently better and more efficient, but in fact, research shows that in many sectors, independent businesses outperform. They deliver better products, cheaper prices, and more innovation. The real answer to what's killing small businesses is rooted in policy choices. 40 years ago, we abandoned our anti-monopoly policies. This has allowed a few corporations to amass extraordinary market power and wield it with impunity. We hear this every day from business owners. People like Ben Okafar, who owns the only pharmacy serving a large rural region of Maine. Okafar's family pharmacy is beloved by the community and busy as can be, and yet he worries that he's going to be driven out of business. And that's because CVS and two other powerful pharmacy benefit management companies control how much he's reimbursed for filling prescriptions. These companies also compete with him. He's watched as CVS has slashed reimbursement rates to independent pharmacies across the country and forced them to close. We've heard similar stories from craft brewers, like Bob Jensen, whose award-winning Argus Brewery in Chicago struggled to get space on store shelves because in his region, distribution is controlled by Anheuser-Busch and Molson Coors. And there are many businesses that are blocked from being able to compete online because of Amazon's outsized market power. People like Doug Merdeza in Michigan, who launched an online business selling hair care products. At first he did well. He quickly grew to nearly 50 employees, but Amazon's dominance meant that he depended on its marketplace for nearly 90% of his sales. Taking advantage of this, Amazon began to ratchet up the fees it charges sellers like Merdeza. By 2020, Amazon was taking nearly half of every dollar his company earned in sales. These fees pushed his business into the red and forced him to lay off most of his staff. America has a monopoly problem. It has rendered our economy less innovative. It's fueled rising inequality and racial injustice. Concentrated market power has made the already steep barriers faced by Black entrepreneurs all but insurmountable. As Chairman Beyer noted, growing numbers, many Black and Brown communities lack basic services like grocery stores and pharmacies because of consolidation. The roots of all of this can be traced to the 1980s when the antitrust agencies and the courts made radical changes to our antitrust policies. They abandoned the longstanding goals of these policies and instituted a new framework known as the Consumer Welfare Standard. It sounds benign, but this approach has blinded and enfeebled antitrust enforcement. It has allowed, for example, large corporations to use their financial muscle to bankrupt smaller competitors and take market share without actually having to compete for it. This happens, for example, through predatory pricing, which involves selling goods or services below cost for a sustained period. We've seen Amazon repeatedly do this. It's a way that big corporations can win simply by being bigger. A small business might have a better product, but it lacks the financial resources to sustain similar losses. Predatory pricing was effectively legalized by the Supreme Court in 1992. We see this in many other ways. Our antitrust agencies and the courts have, for example, allowed vertical integration. I mentioned with CVS and Anheuser-Busch and how they've used that to block their smaller competitors from being able to compete. And third, and finally, the current approach has allowed a few tech giants to seize control of our online markets. Amazon so dominates online shopping traffic that retailers and brands must sell on its site to reach the market. But Amazon also directly competes with these same businesses. Amazon routinely uses its gatekeeper power to exploit the businesses selling on its site. It has spied on these sellers, appropriated their data, and copied their best-selling products. And of course, it pockets a growing share of their fees, as I noted. If Congress does not act to check Amazon's outsized power, we are effectively allowing Amazon to function as a kind of private government that regulates and taxes the nation's commerce and rules over those who engage in it. In my testimony, I outlined several actions that I hope you will take, but I want to underscore particularly the importance, as I close here, of supporting the big tech legislation that's coming out of the House Judiciary Committee. It's the most important legislation in terms of restoring fair markets for our independent businesses. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Mitchell, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And now finally we hear from Mr. Chris Edwards from the Cato Institute and a JEC alum. Mr. Edwards?
Thank you very much, Chairman Beyer and Ranking Member Lee. Thanks for inviting me to testify today. There are growing concerns about rising corporate power, and some measures of industry concentration have certainly increased. However, globalization and technology are creating intense competition for big corporations today. Back in 1980, companies on the S&P 500 list stayed on the list an average of 30 years. Today, companies stay on the S&P 500 list an average of just 20 years. The fear of many big corporations today is that their businesses and industries will get disrupted and overtaken by technology-driven startups. The leading electric car company today in America is Tesla, not any of the major car companies. The mRNA technology behind COVID-19 vaccination was pioneered by biotech firms Moderna and BioNTech, not any of the big pharma giants. We've seen startups displace corporate giants many times in history. In the 70s, IBM dominated the computer industry, and the government prosecuted a 13-year antitrust case against them. But then along came Apple Computer and changed everything. In financial services today, swarms of fintech startups are cutting fees and challenging the big banks. This is all benefiting consumers. Tech startups are pushing prices down to zero in some cases. WhatsApp was a startup that now provides free phone service to 2 billion people around the world. Spotify was a startup that is now #1 in music streaming with its hugely popular free service, ahead of giants Amazon and Apple. The great majority of these tech-driven startups got off the ground with risk capital funding from angel investors and venture capital. To limit corporate power, Congress should support policies to keep investment flowing to high-growth startups. Airbnb was an angel and venture capital funded startup that now competes against the big hotel companies. Elon Musk didn't found Tesla. Instead, he was actually the original angel investor in Tesla back in 2004. So Musk's wealth helped Tesla get off the ground. Moderna and BioNTech were funded by hundreds of millions of dollars of angel and venture capital investment for an entire decade before the pandemic struck last year. In the news recently, I noticed that Breeze Airways was launched in 2021 by the same entrepreneur who founded JetBlue a couple decades ago. The new airline is funded by $100 million of angel and venture capital investment. It plans to undercut the big airlines with super low-cost flights to underserved markets. So how can policymakers support startups to take on the big corporations? Well, first, I think we need to keep capital gains taxes low. Capital gains are the reward for the high risks that investors undertake in investing in companies like Moderna and Tesla. Unfortunately, President Biden is proposing to sharply increase the top capital gains tax rate, but our capital gains rate is already higher than the OECD average. I think a big capital gains tax increase, if applied to startup investing, would be a crushing blow to America's tech industries in particular. Now, currently, the tax code allows investors in some startups to defer or to eliminate their capital gains taxes. However, I fear that the general thrust of current proposals, such as Senator Wyden's plan to use mark-to-market or accrual accounting for capital gains, would kill the benefit of investing in startups. No other OECD country uses accrual or mark-to-market accounting for capital gains. And lastly, I think policymakers should support open entry in markets. Rising regulatory burdens, as some of the other panelists mentioned, often advantage big companies over small ones. Many reforms during the 1970s and 80s show that deregulation increases competition and benefits consumers, such as airline deregulation and telecom deregulation. Deregulation allowed startup FedEx in the 70s to revolutionize package delivery. One of the other panelists mentioned the craft beer industry. Deregulation in the beer industry in the 70s and 80s allowed an explosion of craft beer making, with hundreds of new producers challenging the big beer oligopoly. So in sum, we can limit corporate power to the benefit of consumers by vigorous competition from startups. I think policymakers should remove barriers to entry where they can, and they should support low capital gains taxes to encourage investment in high growth startup. Thank you very much for holding the hearings.
Mr. Edwards, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for your testimony. We'll now begin the round of questions, and I get to go first. So Ms. Mitchell, in Senator Lee's opening statement, he talked about regulation being the cause of corporate concentration. Mr. Edwards just gave some examples of how deregulation led to more small business growth. But in your talking about the challenges that small businesses face, you didn't mention regulation at all. Do you see regulation as the primary reason why small businesses are failing to thrive? Or is it the absence of antitrust enforcement?
It's something of a combination of both, but let me put a little bit of perspective on that, which is that what we're seeing is that as large companies amass market power, they also gain political power. And they are using that power to rewrite legislation, regulations in their own favor and to disadvantage their smaller competitors. I mean, one place where we see this is in the tax code. You know, the very complicated tax code with lots of loopholes that large corporations that are designed for large corporations to slip through. And as a result, you have a situation where Amazon for many years has paid effectively no federal taxes, income taxes. And meanwhile, the local store down the street in your neighborhood is paying an effective federal tax rate of about 25%. That's an example of how our regulations are being warped by concentrated market power to the disadvantage of fair competition and small businesses, workers, and communities.
Great, thank you. Let me move on in a limited time. Dr. Phillip, among your charts, you showed that the high profits that corporations have, 9% of GDP rather than 6%, has not led to higher investment, but rather an increase in share buybacks. Do you see a specific policy proposal that could rein in those share buybacks?
Well, I think the best policy proposal in general in that case is to improve competition. The fact that businesses make a lot of money is not, again, by itself a bad sign. But in a competitive economy, they would be eager to reinvest these profits in order to grow their company faster. So if we make competition more intense, I think that the payouts by themselves are going to decrease simply because firms are going to be forced to reinvest more of their profits. Now, the split between dividend and buybacks is not, in my view, necessarily a first-order issue.
You also said that if we had the competition that, if we hadn't had this concentration of corporate power, the GDP could be 5% higher. Is this a one-time increase of 5%? And would the economy grow more quickly if we had this decrease in corporate concentration?
So this is a very deep question. The number I quoted was for the one-time increase, because this is the one that we can more easily quantify, because it only assumes that firms that have more competitive pressure invest and hire more, which is not a controversial statement, which every economist is going to agree with that. And so then you can quantify this 5% one-time gain. Now, there is also evidence that competition is good for innovation, in which case it would also improve the growth rate of the economy. I did not include that number because it's much harder to quantify, but it's definitely positive. So that would add something on top of it.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Bond, I have a complicated question for you. You have on your page 3 of your remarks, you have this beautiful graph, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. And it shows the concentration of monopsonic labor market power. It reminded me awful much about a political map, how presidential elections are like. Is there an alignment, do you think, between political leanings and monopsonistic market share? Or how would you interpret that?
What we're really seeing in that map that I included is that rural areas tend to have really high levels of concentration. And so they have, when there's lower levels of population, there are fewer employers who end up being dominant and really setting wages for the area. But I don't know if we can say anything speculative about the connection between labor market concentration and political leanings in an area.
I do think we need to take that wonderful chart and give it to some political scientists across the political spectrum to see how to interpret that. It was very, very interesting. We'll be back with more, but now since Senator Lee is off voting, I believe, I'd love to recognize the ranking member on the House side of the Joint Economic Committee, my friend, Mr. Schweikert from Arizona.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer. This is actually an area that Mr. Beyer and I have actually had conversations with over the years, and it's of great interest, but I think actually, and I'm going to give you my perspective, the regulatory side is part of the problem in our failure of design. And let me give you a specific example, and then I'm going to turn to Mr. Philippon and Mr. Edwards to see if my disruption theory fits some of your own writings. I spent years sitting through hearings on Dodd-Frank. The promise of Dodd-Frank was it was going to become a disruption in financial markets, and we were going to see all sorts of new products and new competition. Now, a decade later, we functionally see a concentration of the money center banks. And it turns out there's this term called regulatory arbitrage. You need a much bigger book of business to spread your regulatory costs, therefore wiping out small regional institutions. Yet we had the facts and the data that said if the ultimate thing that created safety and soundness was equity capital, Tier 1 Basel II qualified capital, you could have dropped dramatically the regulatory burden on those regionals and smalls, kept them dramatically safer, and had them chip away at the size of the book of business of the money centers. I use that only as an example because I believe I can show you that from everything from healthcare to pharmaceuticals to manufacturing to others, that we are going to have to look in the mirror, Chairman Beyer, that much of what we do in Congress, whether we want to recognize it or not, we act somewhat like a protection racket. We design legislation specifically directing certain types of products, certain types of technology, certain types of reimbursements, instead of understanding the disruption of technology that's around us. Last example I'll give before the questions is, think about all of our discussions of parts of our country that are underserved with broadband, but yet how often in those very conversations do we understand low Earth orbiting satellites? Actually, now every part of North America now has broadband, but yet we still promote the same type of legislative subsidies that we've been doing for 20 years instead of understanding technology has just created disruption. Mr. Edwards, I understand your focus is on capital markets. Beyond just capital gains, what else would you do in capital markets to allow those small entrepreneurial upstarts, whether it be from a minority community or just some folks creative at a university, to be able to have a capital access, a run, but that their business plan isn't to just be bought out by one of the dominant players? What would you do in the capital markets?
Right. Well, Congress has actually made quite a bit of progress in that respect, particularly with the Jobs Act of 2012.
I'd like to mention 2/3 of those bills were mine.
Well, thank you very much. I think that idea of opening up investment in private equity and venture capital and angel investment to more regular Americans, not just wealthy accredited investors, was the way to go. The legalization of equity crowdfunding, I think that's fantastic. I think it opens up more diverse flows of money to more diverse types of startups. So I think that was all fantastic. There is this basic problem that the regulatory costs of being a public company have gone up, which is one of the reasons why we have far fewer IPOs today, and far more of these companies like Uber and the like stay private longer, which I think is a real problem because it deprives middle-class investors from gaining the benefits of these big boosts in value from these startup companies.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. It's the tyranny of the clock. Ms. Philippon, in the last half a minute, touch on some regulatory arbitrage as being one of the barriers to disruption in our marketplaces, bringing new products, new costs, new opportunities.
Well, so specific in the finance industry or more broadly?
It could be anything, particularly healthcare is the most regulated.
Yeah, so I think that finance and healthcare stand out as two industries where the balance of regulation and efficiency has not been very good. So in finance, clearly we face a trade-off between safety and competition, and we try to balance the trade-off. But if you look fairly at the data, you see that I don't think we managed to find the right balance. The one thing I would point out, though, about Dodd-Frank and the lack, it's get better, but it's not perfect. And some of the lack of competition actually comes from the lack of access to data by some of the new startups. So it turns out that the two main advantages of incumbent large banks are A, deposit insurance, and B, the data that they have. If you could induce them to share their data more with startups, you would have more entry in this market.
We actually have a piece of legislation for securitized debt to flow information out. Chairman Beyer, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Congressman Schweikert. And now I represent our distinguished author, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to say one thing I didn't say in the opening. I really come at this from a point of wanting to rejuvenate our capitalist system. And someone who is in the private sector, I was representing companies for nearly 15 years, not as successful in the private sector as you, Mr. Chairman. But I come at it that way, is how can you spur innovation and how can you make sure that we have the next Google and we have the next Pfizer, and that we are making sure that these startups have an environment where they can not only start, but they can thrive. Mr. Philippon, could you talk about, you have some shocking data there about the decline in the amount of competition and the effect if that continues really across industry. I'm not just talking about tech, without us at least doing something to enforce the antitrust laws, and why Adam Smith himself, the godfather of capitalism, warned against the standing army of monopolies that we must always be aware of in order to make capitalism work.
Thank you very much, Senator. So yeah, I think the issue of monopoly, of course, is an old one. And but to be fair, the reason it is tricky to solve, and I think it's something I did not, of course, have time to talk about in my remarks, is we have to also be honest that we still have a lot of uncertainty. To rebound off something that Chris Edwards said earlier, like we don't know for sure what is good concentration and what is bad concentration. And in the modern knowledge economy, it turns out that intangible assets have become more and more important. And so with the rise of this type of asset, it becomes sometimes difficult to decide, especially in real time, what looks like legitimate concentration earned by just being smarter and working harder from illegitimate concentration. So that's why I think that in the policy framework, especially today, given the uncertainty, I think that we should have a very broad approach. I don't think that antitrust itself could solve all of the issues. I don't think regulation can solve all of the issues, especially as we discussed, regulation can cut both ways. So I think we need at the same time revival of antitrust, reviewing of regulations, and specifically geared towards, I think, again, price transparency. In all the markets where we see the biggest abuse, we see lack of price transparency and barriers to entry. If we focus on these two things, we go a long way towards improving the situation.
Thank you. Dr. Bond, along those same lines, as you know, I've introduced legislation that is a broader approach to reforming our antitrust laws. Do you think we should, and I appreciate the work of the House, and we're working, there are incredible hearings on TAC, and we are working with Representative Cicilline and Buck to introduce versions of their bills. But could you talk briefly about updating our antitrust laws to address concentration in markets, including, by the way, labor markets, something you've talked about?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Klobuchar. So new legislation, like what is included in your proposal, would codify, clarify, and strengthen antitrust law to protect workers. And this would be a really important guide for federal antitrust agencies and judges in antitrust cases who may have the authority to address anti-competitive conduct, but feel they lack the means to do so. So it's really critical that they have that guide and that it is clearly defined as an issue in labor markets that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And maybe you, Ms. Mitchell, by the way, thank you for having the smart decision to go to Macalester College in Minnesota. Ms. Mitchell, could you talk a little bit about the president's executive order and why you think it's so important? Because as we look to update our antitrust laws, as so many Congresses before us has done, from the Clayton Act to Taft-Hartley and beyond, and work that has been done in the past with labor and other things, what do you think we should be doing with the executive order, and why is it important to do both things at the same time?
Thank you, Senator, and I really appreciate your leadership on this issue and the legislation that you've introduced. The executive order is extraordinary in that, it is a repudiation of, I think, the way that we have gone wrong. As President Biden said, we've run a 40-year experiment and it's really failed. America is worse off on so many fronts. The executive order, I think, begins to harness a variety of tools within the agencies to address concentration and create more fair markets for farmers, small businesses, working people, and communities. But I also think it's really important to underscore that this is not a problem that can be solved without Congress, because the courts have taken our laws so far off track that it's really absolutely imperative and so urgent that Congress step in.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair. 14 seconds over for a senator. That's pretty good.
Thank you, Senator, very much. Let me now recognize my wonderful friend from Columbus, Ohio, Congresswoman Beatty.
Thank you so much, Chairman Byers, and certainly to all of my colleagues and to the witnesses. Thank you for all of your expertise. My first question is going to go back to you, Dr. Bond. In your testimony, you discussed the rising usage of the non-compete agreements, even in the case for low-wage workers. You also quoted a lot of information by the 20th century economist Joan Robinson, who had also examined the lack of how the lack of competition led to unfair and inefficient economic outcomes. I read this study, and according to the study of business owners by the Economic Policy Institute, they found that nearly a third of businesses asked all of their employees to sign a non-compete agreement. The Biden administration recently signed executive orders on competition, asking the FTC to ban this practice with very few exceptions. What effect do you think this will have on workers and competition?
Thank you so much, Representative Beatty. I think that the non-compete agreement issue is a really perfect example of a competitive model not bearing out in the real world. If anything, we think workers would be paid more for accepting a non-compete, but we're finding the opposite. And we're finding that they're particularly prevalent for low-wage workers too. Over 20% of low-wage workers are bound by a non-compete. But what happens when you ban the enforceability of non-competes, for example, as Oregon did in 2008, wages in Oregon went up more quickly for workers in jobs that were previously covered by a non-compete compared to jobs that were not previously covered by a non-compete. So there's some evidence that shows that when you ban them, that the wages will go up more quickly. The key piece to this that I just also want to mention is that enforcement of labor protections through the Department of Labor is also a critical tool to ensure that workers are not exploited by anti-competitive conduct. So I think it's really critical to make sure that our enforcement agencies, particularly the Department of Labor, can go after some of this conduct as well.
Thank you so much. Maybe Ms. Wilson or Dr. Philippon, for the past 30 years, our economy has seen a troubling trend of increasing wealth inequality. I'm chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, and as we look at the inequities and the racial, the wealth gap, it's important for me to ask this question. I was reading another study, and according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve, in 1889, the top 10% of Americans owned 67% of the United States wealth. And then more recently, in 2016 or 18, that number was 77%. The bottom 50% of the United States households saw their share of wealth decrease by 67% over that same period of time. Has growing the market in a monopolistic behavior market contributed to this inequality, do you think? And if so, how?
Stacy, why don't you go first?
Sure, thank you for the question. Yes, when you concentrate economic power in decision making, you inevitably concentrate income and wealth. So we have seen a small number of people gain enormously in this economy, and more people are being left behind and harmed by this consolidation. There's a geographic dimension to this. So we see a few metro areas that are seeing good jobs and lots of other cities and regions and rural areas that are being left behind. And there's a very profound racial dimension to this. You know, we have lost lots of Black-owned businesses and banks. We have seen, as Dr. Bond talked about, the effects on wages have been particularly felt in industries that disproportionately employ people of color. I mean, more and more employers are able to take advantage of both racism and economic power to undermine their workforce, and that's a serious issue.
Okay, I'm gonna give you my last 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. So I fully agree with what has been said. Both monopoly power and monopsony power will increase inequality, very much along the line of what Dr. Ban just said earlier. People who happen to be in the wrong labor market are going to see their wages depressed by the monopsony power of local employers. The same happens at the more macroeconomic level, because when monopoly rents are high, shareholders gain more. Now, of course, if every family was a shareholder, then everything would be fine. But if you look at the actual distribution of shares of stocks in the economy, it's very concentrated. So when you shift money away from workers and toward shareholders, you also increase inequality quite significantly, actually.
Okay, thank you. And my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman Beatty. Now let me recognize the gentleman from Madison, Wisconsin, Congressman Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses. This is a great hearing. Appreciate it. I think, Dr. Philippon, let me ask you the first question. I know you've done a lot of work around broadband. I have co-chaired a bipartisan rural broadband task force, or I'm sorry, a caucus, and then also served on Jim Clyburn's rural broadband task force. I live in a rural town, 830 people, and about 3 or 4 years ago, I finally got broadband. Prior to that, I paid $300 a month for 40 measured gigs of broadband because I got a half price sale. for that amount. Many states like Wisconsin, and I think it's a majority of states, have laws that you pretty much have to get broadband from the provider that has your area. We weren't allowed to form a co-op. We weren't allowed to buy from a neighboring community. So we either went without broadband, or when a company got free money from the federal government, they decided to expand it into our area. You've done a lot of work in this area. Can you talk a bit about this, what we can do to try to make it so that people can have affordable broadband? My broadband now is 50 Mbps, and I pay about $90 a month in that rural area.
Thank you very much for the question. This one hits close to home because that's one of the motivation for writing the book. Because when I came to the US from Europe 20 years ago, and at that time, connection to the internet were a lot cheaper in the US than in Europe because that market was highly competitive. And so it was a shock for me to see that over the following 20 years, since completely turned around. And so now it's actually cheaper to get broadband access in Paris or Berlin than it is to get access in Washington or New York. So clearly, the name of the game would be to increase competition. One of the issues you have in the US is that the setup of the market is state by state. And so it's very hard to find a solution that would work across the entire country. It has to be state by state. And that means that, first of all, I don't think every state is going to necessarily find the same solution, but it means that increasing competition by bringing new providers is going to be tricky, at least in the short term, which is why probably you have to go step by step by first targeting directly the prices that are charged, and then in a second step, bringing competition. I don't think jumping directly to having many more providers is going to be practical, even though it would be ideal.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Mitchell, I have a question for you. So I'm a small business owner since I was 23 years old, but a small business, 5 employees. These days, they refer to that as a micro business, which most of us hate as a terminology if you're under 20 employees. But as you've pointed out, the amount of business revenue for small businesses has have since the 80s. And, even when we were putting together regulation to help small businesses through COVID, honestly, I fought with my own party at times in understanding small businesses because we don't have the same year-to-year sort of sales. We don't have, the issues that a bigger business has. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the main threats that you're seeing to those small independent business and, what we could do in the short term around that?
Thank you for the question. And yes, micro business. The other one I think is mom and pop that people really hate. It has a sort of derogatory tone. I think this is how many business owners hear it. Yeah, in our research and in the surveys we've done large national surveys of independent businesses. We do see issues of market power really top that list. There are other concerns, the high cost of health insurance, for example, is one, but we see lots of different kinds of market power issues. The incredible fees that Visa and MasterCard are able to charge, and you can't say no to the credit cards. For restaurants, the DoorDashes of the world have also become a kind of gatekeeper, charging these big tolls, and there's not enough competition there or regulation. But I am really particularly struck by the fact that I think Amazon's just incredible reach into different markets, its gatekeeper power across a lot of different sectors. I mean, online is where everything is moving. And if you have a company that controls your access to the online market and competes against you, it's a fundamental problem. And that's why I think the big tech breakup bill is so crucial.
Yeah. And we also let our employees actually go to the restroom and things. And, that somehow makes us less competitive against the Amazons of the world, unfortunately. But I fully appreciate that. Since I have 10 seconds, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman, very much. And now, if Senator Lee is there, I know his camera's on. I see a staff person occasionally. But if not, I would love to yield to my good friend from San Diego, Congressman Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. And at the risk of repeating some of what Congressmember Beatty was talking about, I did want to ask a little bit about non-competes. According to analysis from the Economic Innovation Group, greater enforceability of these contracts reduces new firm entry by 18%. And states that enforce non-competes tend to have lower prevailing wages than states that do not enforce. Overall, one in 5 workers without a college degree is subject to a non-compete agreement, and 30 to 40% are not asked to sign these agreements until they've accepted the position. Dr. Bond, I know you've looked at this, and I want to just clarify, is there any reason a worker that does not have access to proprietary information should be subject to a non-compete agreement? What would those circumstances be?
I think there are very few circumstances in which a non-compete agreement, or especially being compelled to sign a non-compete agreement, has an economic justification, such as trade secrets. I think, as you're noting, by and large, it seems that workers are facing maybe monopolistic conditions, cannot bargain over the conditions of the wage offer that they receive, or so they have to accept them anyway. And it tends to be some of these low-wage workers, with Jimmy John sort of being the archetype example of an employer who had non-competes for their workers for no economic justification. And as I mentioned with Congressman Beatty, that it lowers wages, it reduces wage growth. It really is not good for particularly low-wage workers in these markets.
So you mentioned Jimmy John's. Are there particular industries where we know this has been especially damaging, going from one to the ability for this labor market to be effective?
I'm not aware of the particular industries, but I do know that it is something like 20% of workers who earn below the median wage in the US are subject to a non-compete agreement, which is a really high level if we consider that low-wage workers are less likely to be in those occupations that we could say justifiably have some sort of economic justification for signing a non-compete agreement.
I heard some mention earlier of the president's executive order, which I certainly welcome. And I hope it goes a long way to help workers. Although I do think that, and maybe you could tell me if you agree, congressional action is important in this space. I introduced the Workforce Mobility Act, which effectively bans non-compete agreements except in limited circumstances like protecting trade secrets. In San Diego, the innovation ecosystem is the backbone of the economy. We need policies to make sure that workers can compete everywhere. Do you believe, Dr. Bond, that congressional action is important in this space?
I absolutely do. And I think encouraging mobility in the labor market is one of the most important things we can do to have a dynamic and healthy economy. So I think policies that are explicitly designed to encourage worker mobility are what we need to have growth in our labor market going forward from the crisis. And we need explicit legislation. The current executive order is a good start, but it is just sort of encouragement for the FTC to address the issue, where I think enforceability through the Department of Labor is really critical. They have the infrastructure to address labor market violations, and they've been successful in doing so.
Maybe I'd ask Ms. Mitchell to, if you have an opinion on the extent to which non-compete agreements are a downward force on starting new small businesses and local economies that have been hurt by the pandemic, maybe?
It's absolutely a problem. I mean, not only can workers covered by these non-compete agreements not go out and start their own enterprises in that same field that they have skills in, but it also means if you're a new startup, your ability to attract skilled workers is also impeded. And so it's a huge effect on startups.
Right, thank you. I actually wanted to ask a question of Mr. Edwards. Your testimony talked about the importance of open markets. And I wanted to give you the chance to respond to this notion that this concern that's been raised about firms that control the market and compete against the people who are allowed in that market. Doesn't that create an anti-competitive situation that inhibits the ability of private capital to invest in new innovation?
Well, I mean, if you're, big corporations have, I agree with the other panelists when there's regulations and the like preventing open entry, but a lot of huge corporations like Amazon got where they are because of the huge high productivity, and they stay ahead of the pack by investing massively in R&D, which has broad-based spillover benefits for the whole economy. I would note,
yeah, I guess
yeah.
Well, I guess the concern I would raise is that when Amazon's become the market and they're competing against the people in the market, I think that creates an issue. And I take your point on private equity investment and on capital gains. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think that that's something that hasn't been addressed and is still a concern for me. And I've exceeded my time, so I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Scott, very much. And David and Scott, we're going to do another round of questions while we await the return of Senator Lee, who hasn't had a chance to do a first round of questions, but should be back shortly. So I'll begin, but please think about it and you're welcome to ask again. So let me start with Dr. Philippon. Mr. Edwards talked about supporting risk capital via lower taxes on capital gains. And obviously that's very much in play with the potential Biden tax plans. How much of a challenge is capital today in the market? And is competition essentially a money problem?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's a very important question. My reading of the evidence today is that it's not the volume of financing that's constraining innovation. There is, I mean, when you talk to industry people, they tend to argue that there's tons of money floating around looking for deals. So I don't think the supply of funds is necessarily the biggest issue. So in that sense, I don't necessarily think that increasing taxes in a reasonable way would necessarily have a very large impact there. But I do think one of the issue is if you look at the exit of firms that do get financing, the fraction of firms that decide to go public and remain independent has decreased significantly over time. And more of the firms now, whether purposefully or not, end up being acquired. And so I think that, in my mind, is actually the bigger issue.
Thank you very much. I will, Mr. Edwards, I'll get back to you in just a minute on that. Dr. Bond, you talked about how the labor share of income has declined and argue that a larger labor share of income would be a very good thing for workers. Would it also lead to faster economic growth? Or what's its impact on economic growth?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So as you noted, the labor share of income has been declining. And part of how I interpret this is that the forces constraining monopoly power have decreased over time, at the same time that we've seen more of economic growth going to capital and less to labor. As Professor Philippon noted, rising profits have gone to payouts rather than investments that would spur innovation and growth. And finally, economic research has suggested that the labor share of income is positively correlated with economic growth in the long run. So it's important for the entire economy to ensure that workers are earning the value they're contributing to economic growth.
You know, one of the big issues with Democrats and Republicans for this, as long as I've been in there, is trying to come up with the more anemic economic growth of the teens to much faster in the next generation. And then Ms. Mitchell, you know, we now have these credit deserts, the disappearance of community banks and just the big banks everywhere. The hope was that fintech firms would fill that gap. Do you see any evidence that that's happening?
No, in the sense that, you know, the kind of lending that community banks is long-term lending where they're engaged with a business, helping them grow and develop over time, and doing that often at reasonable interest rates and on reasonable terms. Many of the fintech operations that we see charge very high rates. They're short-term loans. They're not based in the same community. When they are under stress during a financial downturn, for example, they may call those loans very quickly, exactly what you don't want to have happen for a business facing a downturn. So those are not good replacements. I am deeply worried about the decline of community banks. In the last 10 years, we've lost 40% of all of our community banks.
Great, thank you very much. Let me now yield to Senator Lee, who has returned for us. Senator, thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edwards, I'd like to start with you. You know, American businesses are some of the most innovative in the world. As you note in your testimony, we're global leaders in computer technology and business services and in pharmaceutical development, just to name a few. The most disruptive innovators, that is where American businesses and workers are on the leading cutting edge, are often pioneered by new companies entering an existing market to challenge an outdated product or service. Now, you mentioned that the threat of higher taxes could make it harder to fund future innovative startups. Can you elaborate on how tax hikes or threatened tax hikes could make big businesses even bigger, and why market-based competition is such an effective check on corporate power?
Well, venture capital is a unique American success story. It is the reason why lists of the most innovative companies in the world, the great majority of them are American, because we have had since the late 70s this massive flow of venture capital partly triggered by a famous 1978 cut in the federal capital gains tax rate. Chairman Beyer talked about a little bit about the flow of funds to startups, and it's true, there's a huge flow of funds to startups now, which is fantastic. So I'm saying don't break the American system of moderate capital gains taxes and everything we have going on in places like Silicon Valley. Let's not break that. We're doing great with launching new high growth businesses. That is the way to challenge these big corporations going forward.
Well, thank you. My own state, the state of Utah, is fortunate to have had strong economic growth in recent years, as well as one of the strongest pandemic recoveries. Utah currently has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation, and its GDP growth far surpasses the national growth rate. Our population growth over the last decade was also the highest in the nation. I attribute the state's resilience and continued economic prosperity to its business-friendly policies and its strong communities, families, and social ties. This is a concept we refer to as social capital. So, Mr. Edwards, as you pointed out in your research, many entrepreneurs face increasing tax and regulatory challenges at the federal, state, and local level. These government impediments make starting and maintaining a thriving business needlessly complex and costly. And at the federal level, the REINS Act would give Americans an important check on costly federal regulation by helping to hold executive branch agencies accountable. And I believe the REINS Act would make a meaningful difference for small businesses and entrepreneurs in the long term in particular. In your view, what are some of the other important reforms that might help clear the path for innovation and support new business formation?
Well, I think that there's problems, and I think Dr. Philippon has talked about this in his research. There's problems, regulatory problems at all three levels of government that block entrepreneurship. I mean, I applaud President Biden for looking at the issue of occupational licensing. As you may know, the share of U.S. jobs that require occupational license has gone up from 5% in the 1950s up to over 20% today. There's at the state level, there's certificate of need laws that block new investment in healthcare. There's a big problem with U.S. airports. The U.S. airports, the way they're run as monopoly government authorities tends to block new airline entry into the business. So I think there's problems at all three levels of government on the regulatory matter. The last point is back in the 70s, deregulation of airlines and trucking and many other industries was very much a bipartisan reform approach that everyone agrees was very successful. I mean, I mentioned the beer industry, which Jimmy Carter deregulated at the federal level, airlines, and many other things. So I think deregulation to help small upstart businesses can be bipartisan.
Yeah, so with regard to the airports, are you aware of any policy proposal on how we could fix that issue? I have seen that, where you've got slots that are carefully allocated, and that's made it almost impossible to have new entrants. How do you fix that?
So there's some Brookings economists have written extensively about this. There's this problem with dominant carriers in hub airports write these contracts with the government airport authorities that excludes new entrants to gates. The way to fix that is the way they've done it in Britain, which is you privatize the airports, like Heathrow is private. Private airports have a much bigger incentive to open gates to real-time sort of pricing to allow upstart airlines to come in and buy gate space. In a lot of U.S. cities, that's blocked. And the last point on this is we have a government authority in New York that owns all three airports. That makes no sense. And in D.C., the same authority owns National and Dulles. Why is that? Why not privatize the airports and let, for example, Reagan and Dulles compete with each other? So, I think airports are something that, again, could be a bipartisan reform area.
Well said. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, very much. I now recognize, and Senator, we're doing a second round, so if you're inclined, we'll come back around to you again. Senator Congressman Peters, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe I'll pick up again with Mr. Edwards just to see if I can get your answer on the concern raised about if it's true that Amazon might have so much of own the market and be competing against the market at the same time. How does that not discourage investment and innovation?
Well, I think you can see Amazon both ways. I mean, Amazon has been successful because it's been incredibly productive, and it's provided opportunities for millions and millions of small businesses. I can see that there's an issue that they also compete against small businesses, but there's no reason why new platforms can't arise with a different model and compete against Amazon. I really don't believe that. I think any big corporation can be beat by upstart competitors.
Okay.
If you look at industry, I mean, 15 years ago, Apple dominated music streaming. Now Spotify has blown them away. It was a small startup in Sweden. So I think upstarts can take on any companies, even the biggest.
Okay. So you're not necessarily arguing that that's a competitive model, but you're saying someone could just rise up and replace Amazon or compete with Amazon is what you're suggesting.
Absolutely. It's not going to happen overnight, but it could well. I don't see any reason why marketplaces couldn't gravitate to new platforms in the future.
Did you want to address why it's okay to have non-compete agreements in the fast food industry?
So, non-competes is interesting. You mentioned you're from California. California's banned non-competes for over a century, which is very interesting. I think that's actually been important for the rise of Silicon Valley and high tech in places like San Diego. So I actually think that is a state issue. States can solve that problem anytime they want, if they desire.
All right, appreciate it. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, the chance to hear both sides of it, and I think we're informed. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Peters. And now I recognize Congressman Schweikert for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is one of those conversations which I wish I had one of my charts, because there's a hierarchy here of what creates a competitive, disruptive economy, and then helps remove or compete away dominant market players. And we see what the Biden administration's just recently done, what you've actually just talked about on some of the executive orders, using the regulatory mechanisms. My concern, and I want to come back to this, is that many of the things you and I and our brothers and sisters in Congress do are actually anti-competitive, and yet often we don't realize we're doing it. I appreciate, Mr. Edwards, the comment on the Jobs Act, but that's almost a decade ago, and it took how many years to even get an incremental equity crowdsource funding mechanism, and even then it's it barely exists because of the bureaucracy around it. In many ways, we empower the bureaucracy in such fashions that an economy that should be running on disruptions and that innovation, and that creates the price pressures and the new systems of delivery. You and I keep supporting regulatory environments, reimbursement in healthcare, and others where I don't think we realize we're not being agnostic. Think of some of the things we're doing on energy right now, where we call out specific types of energy instead of doing pieces of legislation and say, we're agnostic. We don't care if it has these attributes. We don't care what the generation source is. And you let innovation and disruption take place. Mr. Edwards, and I know your specialization has been taxation, capital markets. What do we do as policymakers to maximize that disruptive type of economy that is in many ways gives everyone a fighting chance to be that successful entrepreneur? Can you think of items within both the federal bureaucracy and our legislative agenda that would help that happen?
Well, I mean, I'm in favor of further liberalization of the rules on, accredited investors. There's a good argument.
That's also my other bill.
Right. I mean, there's a good argument that we shouldn't even have those rules. I think giving middle-class Americans access to investment in private equity, expanding and liberalizing those rules, that's an important thing to do. With capital gains is really important. Not only for the investors, I mentioned angel investors and venture capital, but for the entrepreneurs themselves. If you have a high capital gains tax rate, people don't want to be entrepreneurs. They're going to want to go for salary jobs. And also, about 3/4 of all tech firms in Silicon Valley, they use stock options for employees, where the benefit again is capital gains. So, Silicon Valley companies, they're cash poor. What they have is they can offer stock options. That has been hugely important for Silicon Valley and other tech clusters. So I'm saying let's not break what has worked in the United States for our tech industry.
But any thoughts of what we could do in the tax and regulatory world for the true sort of micro entrepreneur? The minority woman that lives down the street from me who is actually starting a series of barbecue trucks.
I just published a study a month or so ago at Cato looking at state and local regulations, and I list about 15 or 16 different types of regulation. One very interesting area that is home-based businesses. 2/3 of all American businesses are launched at home, but a lot of cities have tight zoning laws that prevent home-based businesses from starting. Apple was started in a garage. Hewlett Packard was started in a garage. Amazon was started in a garage. Home-based businesses are really important, and that's something that should be an area of bipartisan reform.
And Chairman Beyer, they're back to the need for the chart of the hierarchy of both the things we could do at the regulatory level for those companies that are using their oligopoly power, but all the way down to regulatory bureaucracies, state and local, and those of us in the federal government, and what we do tax-wise, and becoming technology neutral, whether it be from healthcare to environment to other things. We could probably have that disruptive revolution that creates a much more egalitarian economy. And with that, I yield back.
Congressman Schweikert, thank you. I'm going to have to get you together with Mr. Haga of our Joint Economic Committee team, who's the only other person I know who is as chart-philic as you are. And with that, I want to thank each of our witnesses today for their expert contributions. Competition is foundational to a strong economy. It helps place the promise of the American dream within reach for workers and entrepreneurs, but the concentration of corporate market power subverts this promise, worsening economic inequality and hindering productivity and economic growth, as we have heard again and again this afternoon. To promote shared prosperity, Congress must continue to advance an economy where all can compete and contribute. So thank you to Professor Philippon. We hope that the fireworks are fun tonight on Bastille Day in Paris. Thanks for helping us understand the economics of competition, how to restore open markets, and for explaining how our failed experiment and lax antitrust enforcement has led to reduced investment, weaker productivity growth, higher prices, and stagnant wages. And thank you to Dr. Bond for breaking down the word monopsony and for sharing your expertise on how the erosion of competition in labor markets impacts workers. As you made clear, when employers must compete for labor, it leads to higher wages, more flexible hours, and better benefits for workers. And I'm eager to share your chart, the Bindenbauer-Hirschhorn, with some political scientists, because there's a lot more to be pulled from that. And thank you to Ms. Mitchell for sharing your insights into the challenges that small businesses face, and specifically the examples that you cited from around the country. This is vital to our understanding of how they are impacted by rising corporate power. And your focus on solutions to strengthen communities and restore the ability of small businesses to compete will guide our work. We're also grateful to Mr. Edwards. It's always good to have somebody from Cato to come with us to share your thoughts and expertise with us today. And it's a special treat to welcome former JEC staff as expert witnesses. Thanks also to all my colleagues for joining this important discussion and sharing your insights. We have the power to restore competition and build shared prosperity by vigorously enforcing our antitrust laws and adapting them to the 21st century, by funding our federal enforcement agencies, and by protecting the rights of workers to organize. We commit to moving these ideas forward, and we do this important work. We hope to continue to rely on your expertise and good faith. So thank you all for participating today. The record will remain open for 3 business days, and this hearing is formally adjourned.